Good
How
to
you
be here,
doing?
Nick. How are you, man?
I'm doing all right. I saw your first pitch Florida stuff. I got that email again earlier today. I don't know if that was you or Brent who sent that one out, but
That particular
yeah.
one was Brent, but you
Okay.
had a 50-50 shot.
A 50-50 shot. Well, I'm excited just to be there at the end of next month. Actually, sorry, the start of March, I should say. March 3rd through 5th. Guys, you got to come out. It was a great time when we went in 2020. I'm really excited to do that one in person again. So thanks for putting that on. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to it, right?
Same here. Being in person, we've done it a couple of times post-pandemic in Arizona. We haven't gotten back to Florida yet. This will be our first time back since, the
Oh,
week
man.
before the world ended, right? It was
Right.
first weekend of March 2020. I remember having conversations with people like, "Are you going to wear a mask on a plane? Maybe I should wear a mask on a plane." We were so
Yeah.
dumb. We
It
were so dumb.
was it was wild. But I know. Thanks so much for being here and being a part of PitchCon.
Absolutely happy to help.
Next, yeah, thank you. Next up, we've got Derek Cardy. How you doing, Derek Cardy? Cardy, how you doing? I don't know why I'm saying it like that. Oh, you're on mute, by the way. You also have a lovely apartment behind you.
Why, thank you. Thanks for having me on. This should be fun.
I didn't know you moved into a new place. Looks wonderful, Derek.
Oh yeah, it's gorgeous. This
Yeah.
is
Oh, it's awesome. No, thanks a lot for being here. Of course, the Bat and Bat X is courtesy of Derek, and Rudy is here, but his camera isn't. So I was gonna welcome him on, but it's just now he realizes it's not working. There we go. There it is, Rudy.
Yeah. I feel embarrassed because I don't live in Cliff Kingsbury's old house like Derek.
Man. Rudy, of course, part of Rasball and is the head of all projections and tools over there. Thanks so much for joining, Rudy.
Oh, thanks for having.
And all right, guys, I'm gonna let you take it away. Thanks so much for taking the time to be a part of PitchCon, and looking forward to this one.
Thanks, Nick. Go take 55 minutes or so. We'll be here. Derek, Rudy, how are you guys doing?
doing well.
Yeah, doing okay.
Excellent. Why don't we start by talking a little bit about your approach to projections, your projection system. There are different types of projection systems, and maybe we should talk about sort of what the landscape looks like and then where our individual approaches fit into that landscape.
Yeah, so I guess my projection system is the BAT and the BAT X. Basically, I guess you could say it's a more traditional type of projection system, at least in the foundational structure of it. It includes regression to the mean, it includes multiple years of data, it includes aging curves, and then I kind of layer on a bunch of additional stuff on top of that. A lot of adjustments for context. Recently a lot of stuff with StatCast type stuff, launch angles, barrels, exit velocity, sprint speed, all that good stuff. Diced up in different ways. I guess that's kind of just the general overview of what the BAT is, and it adjusts for future context as well. What the schedule is going to be like, what ballparks they're going to be in, what time of year it is, what the weather's like at that time of year, quality of opposition, all that kind of stuff.
And yeah, that's a great point. And Rudy, maybe you can build on that a little bit because, even within a projection system, projecting different data elements present a different set of problems, right? You can look at a batter who's hit 287, 286, 285 in the last 3 years, and projecting next year's batting average is probably going to lead you to a pretty narrow range of outcomes. But from there, you can get into runs and RBIs that are team contextual or pitcher wins. And then you get into what happens when you change the environment, either of the player on their team or their ballpark or the overall MLB environment, from things like the ball, sticky stuff. We got an hour to cover all of these topics, but even saying like a system is designed in a traditional way, there's a lot of nuance within that, right? So with that, talk about Rasball a little bit.
Yeah, so ours is a kind of collaboration between myself and Steamer. Similar to Derek, yeah, the traditional way, which I think Marcel's is maybe like where we kind of begin with, is that I view it as that you've got certain skills that are that they're true skills or very close to it, and you're usually regressing to the mean based on past stats, bringing in anything to try to like Statcast to estimate those skills. Where I tend to come in, I use Steamer for that. Where I tend to come in is starting with the contextual stuff. Saves and holds are ones obviously where you just kind of almost append it to the data. But
I
to
don't
me,
even do saves and holds. Saves and holds
I
are
know,
nonsense,
right?
and guys like you are much better than me.
No, and I think, I mean, yeah, it's funny because I think those that do projections, that yeah, from the outside view, would be like, oh, you guys think you know everything, and it's like, no, you really try to focus on the things that you know well and figure out who does it better for the others. So for the regression stuff, for most of it, it's going through Steamer. I've started with doing the saves and holds and the playing time, which is a huge component that you could totally outsource. Derek, you outsource the playing time, right?
Yeah, I use ATCs in the preseason and Fangraphs depth charts in season.
Yeah. And then, and I've kind of extended over time. Like wins is something where there's a little bit, you could project that, but it tends to be derived off of team and personal skills. So wins, runs, RBIs. I just started doing Babbitt. Um, and then mine will extend into playing time and into the valuating what those projections end up being. So it's all kind of packaged in at Rasball.
Yeah, and just to complete the circle here, I run the projections at Baseball HQ, and we're sort of a hybrid that starts with the Marcel Steamer multi-year weighted average, and then much like you were describing, Rudy, we sort of come in with the manual approach after that. Generally, as we're writing the baseball forecaster in the fall, we'll put the baseline projection that comes out of that system through multiple wash rinse cycles of review, from a writer to multiple levels of editor to the guy who's got his book name on the book cover of the forecaster, Ron Chandler, to all look at that projection and say, for the contextual factors or for trends that the system may not be fully accounting for all of the other screwiness, including how do you do a weighted average when one of your 3 years right now is still a 60 game sprint season. All sorts of those things kick in and lead to
Totally.
lead to putting your our sort of thumb on the scale, as it were.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, and yeah, that's that. And the 60-day thing's nothing compared to minor league equivalencies.
Yeah, totally.
Or foreign league equivalencies. So there's a lot that kind of goes in there. It's not bad to divide and conquer or to collaborate and stuff like that. But I think once you put a name on it, it feels like it's like a single entity.
Yep.
But almost all of them aren't, except I guess maybe some that the people that kind of do it themselves, kind of, let's say, a curated, handcrafted projection tends to be kind of a one-man shop. But I imagine they're very highly influenced by all the other ones. So nothing's ever purely done in a vacuum.
Which, jumping around a little bit, we sort of had a loose agenda for this, but figured we'd be blown in a number of different directions here. So jumping around a little bit, given that there are a number of different approaches, a number of different baseline structures that can lead into these things, what are the benefits of using multiple systems or aggregating, as you were saying? You mentioned Ariel Cohen, who for Fangraphs produces his own aggregated projection, so you could even aggregate multiple people into your own system in one shot by pulling in an ATC, or you could go out and pull in the three of our projections, for lack of a different example, and build your own Franken monster. Given that, I think what we're saying here is different systems are all going to have different strengths. Is that an effective approach to pull from others? I mean, my first question, if I'm sitting here thinking about that, is, well, how do you take the time to figure out who's the best at what and get the best of everything, right? That's kind of not an easy question to answer, even if you wanted to.
No, that's true. I mean, it's definitely a skill set in itself in terms of evaluating and running. Obviously, probably a lot of people on this listening in have had the fun of trying to map different systems together. but and then evaluating, doing either correlation or Rimsey tests. There's a few different ways you can get about it. That takes a certain skill, and there are usually a couple of those published every year.
Yeah.
Yeah, to me, the aggregating, it's like, I'll say, like, even with someone as a vested interest, it's like there is such a thing as wisdom of crowds. I mean, I do Fantasy Pros weekly rankings in football and fight the same fight of, being like an individual voice in that, and then you see how the aggregate performs. There's definitely something to it. I'm also a big fan of parsimony, and so like I've people I respect, I'll see like tweets on like, I've aggregated 5 projections and here's what I have, and it's like, I think after 2 you're probably not adding anything that, like, I would say in general, if you're adding 2 together or averaging, don't add 2 together because then the numbers are way high. But if you average the 2 together, and they're 2 good ones, you're probably good right there. You've probably, helped smooth out some of the outliers. But in some of the testing I've done, it's like, I don't see much beyond 2. I think it's a bit overkill. Maybe it's helpful in a couple cases if one doesn't go as deep into the player pool as another. What's your take, Derek?
I mean, one of the weird things I see people do sometimes is they say, okay, I'm aggregating, I'm averaging these 5 systems together or whatever. And one of them is like ATC, which is already an aggregate.
Yes.
Like if you want to aggregate, like maybe
Yes.
just use one of the systems that's already doing it.
I'm buying a mutual fund and it's composed of index funds.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to diversify.
So yeah, like if you want to aggregate, I do think there's value to that for sure. Aggregates are generally going to be the most accurate system. The bat will give them a run for its money a lot of years in these tests that get run by people, which is always really nice to see because it's really tough to beat an aggregate, at least on average, because an aggregate is going to wash out the outliers. Essentially, it's going to wash out the outliers. It's going to wash out a lot of the noise. You're going to get a more condensed pool, basically, which in a way is kind of nice. It's like a wisdom of the crowds kind of thing. But then you do wash out a lot of, I think, some of the good things that you do have in a standalone system. Something like, and I just use my own because it's what I'm familiar with, but like the BATX will account for things that a lot of other systems won't. It'll account for the StatCast stuff, and it'll account for different contexts that other systems maybe aren't accounting for. And if you aggregate, you're going to lose that. The outliers out there that the bat has because of these specific factors that other systems aren't, it's going to pull those guys in, which is not necessarily something you may want.
Yeah. And you're already pulling everything in with ADP. So like, I think, you're never going into, or I'm never going into a draft, even if I'm using just my projections, which is typically what I was doing, without knowing ADP. So you're already kind of moving towards that. So you're not overdrafting guys who might be too high on your thing, and it's you're naturally probably avoiding guys that are below you have below the ADP. But yeah, no, I'm kind of I think Derek and I kind of agree on this one, and ours. I feel like ours give a run for the money in times. I think especially it's in my eyes, I think aggregates build up steam as we get closer to opening day, and I think they start weaker because there's not as many projections to choose from. They're not as informed. I think things taking the guesses on who's going to get playing time is a lot tougher now than it is on March 30th after 30 days of spring training lineups. So I would say that the one thing is that if you're doing the test on March 30th, it's really tough to beat an aggregate right now. I'm a little more skeptical. I think I think my odds would be better than they would be on March 30th.
And a huge part of this, I think what both of you are saying, and I fully agree with, is if you're going to aggregate yourself, if you're going to use an aggregate projection, you need to be aware of what you're using. Sort of definitionally, you're not going to be staring at a projection at a draft table that is at that table the high or low on the player, right? You're going to be in the middle.
Yeah.
So you've got to, if you're going to use those numbers, you better have some other criteria to decide when you're going to the mat, when you're paying the extra dollar, when you're bumping the guy above his ADP, whatever it is, because the aggregate projection will never steer you to do that.
Correct.
Exactly.
Matters how bad you are at Excel.
But the other thing I wanted to say about aggregates, Rudy, I think you hit on this earlier, but here, there are multiple components to developing a good projection. We were going through that 5 minutes ago, but the one that I think we sort of glossed over that is massively important is playing time. I've played with aggregating projections or doing comparisons or trying to smooth out. There's nothing worse in my mind than walking into a draft room, where everybody knows you're using the projections you published. It's kind of frustrating. It's like they have your answer key, right? So
Yeah.
I've looked at trying to blend the HQ projections with something else to sort of take the edge off that. But the problem I ran into is that I trust our own playing time numbers. And if you keep one set of playing time numbers and pull in the rate stats from as many other different systems as you want, it don't matter, because the playing time is what is going to drive the vast majority of the projection anyway. And I was like, well, but this is the data I trust. I'm going to use this data, and you can run all the comparisons on what what the change is. And like, if I found a guy whose home run projection moved by 3 over the same number of at bats, that was a lot. Right.
Oh no, that's funny. I've run it because I'm experimenting this year. So I ran a test looking at my rankings, my derived ones using going through our player rater, and then I blended with a second on just rates and used my playing time. And the difference, and then I basically compared it to ADP and NFBC, converting that into like dollars. So I basically. Yeah. And the lift on using a second one, because you'd think the more you aggregate, the closer you'll get to ADP. It was such a small lift on that. I tend to agree with you that playing time does drive a lot, and it is undervalued in general. It's just because no one really knows who does it. Like, I've heard so many times, I can't believe the Steamer or the Bat says that this is a guy's playing time. And it's like, the guy's name's Jason Martinez. He's doing it over at Fangraphs.
Yeah, I hear that a lot. It's like, why do you have this guy projected for so many at bats? It's like, I don't, guys. Like, I don't.
Yeah.
And he does. I mean, and man, he keeps this stuff up to date. It's a good for me. And I kind of try to do the same. But and that's always it's good to know who you're going to check and balance against. So I think playing time sources, and that's one where I think good players, if there's there's a guy or two that you don't like the playing time, there's no reason. You don't need to call up Derek. You don't need to ask. Don't need to call me. Good luck trying to get Steamer. Just adjust it. It's totally good if you think every guy's going to get called up sooner. That is one of the key differences. And sometimes when you're picking a breakout, like anyone who was feeling bullish last year on Julio Rodriguez that he'd make the opening day roster killed it a week before the regular season. So that's go ahead. No. Go ahead.
I think that's a really good point. Like, I get a lot of questions from people sometimes, like what is the projection missing? Like, if I'm going to try to adjust it or put in my own manual input, what's the best way to do it?
Yeah.
And the playing time really is the aspect that it makes the most sense to do it with, because playing time is a subjective judgment from somebody.
Yep.
There's a lot that goes into it. If you're a fan of a certain team and you really think this guy, they really like him and he's going to get more time, adjust the projection based on that. Don't adjust it based on, well, this guy improved his launch angle last year and his StatCast stuff looks so good. I'm just going to raise the projection. He's going to, instead of 20 home runs, I'm going to project him for 30 home runs because his launch angle was so good last year. It's like the projection knows that. It's already accounting for it. Like, don't double count things.
Yeah, there's definitely the double counting thing. I mean, it hits on for all sports and all stats. Yeah, that if you're thinking I'm going to adjust this because of this other thing I'm bringing in, like, or he's projected for 200 runs plus RBIs, and he's hitting middle of the lineup.
Yeah.
So
it's important to understand what goes into whatever projection system
Yeah.
you're using. Understand what is going into it and what is not going into it before you start trying to change it.
100%. I had this comment from one of our readers this week who was asking in the HQ forums, like, hey, what I'm trying to do is I'm taking a look at your projections and I'm overlaying them with ex-WOBA and trying to find guys who ex-WOBA likes more than that and thinking that that's a place where I should raise the projection. And I said, well, ex-WOBA actually looks a lot like our quality of batted balls metric, which measures most of the same things, exit velocity, launch angle, etc. We saw that number. We saw those numbers. We saw those QBAB ratings when we built our projection. So if you're going to bring an ex-WOBA and put your thumb on the scale from there, then you run the risk of double counting, like you say, or you may identify a bunch of guys who we had that same information, but de-emphasized it relative to other metrics like a disastrous contact rate or whatever else goes into it. And it's very hard to come at such an integrated system, yours, mine, ours, whatever, that has so many more elements and say, you know what, one more element is going to be what actually makes this work, right? It just needs a little more oregano and we're all set.
Right. Now this reminds me, you remember when Jim Bowden, who is kind of a member of our community now, right, when he was a GM, he really, really, really loved toolsy guys.
Mm-hmm.
There was Elijah Dukes, Willie Mopena. There's a type, and I almost feel like that particular StatCast stats, because you could always watch a guy who had the tools, but the people that go, but look at his StatCast chart is kind of like how Jim Bowden was, where it's like, look, he hit 250 and he has all these tools. It's like, no, he kind of hit 250 besides he had all those tools. Yeah, with all those tools, he hit 250. Those tools ain't going anywhere. Like maybe there's other things that are baked into the real stats.
Those StatCast charts drive me crazy. Like seeing people tweet out, especially like, oh, well, why do you have him projected like this? Look at his StatCast. It's so good. Why don't you like him more? The StatCast stuff, like people don't realize, that StatCast stuff is great. Like it goes into the bat. I use it. It's cool. It's not perfect. It's not like the actual skill of the player. It's the skill of the player with a little bit less noise than basic home runs or whatever. But there's still a lot of noise in that StatCast stuff, way more than a lot of people realize. And you can't just look at what he did last year with StatCast and say, all right, that's who he is, because that's not who he is.
Right. No, generally.
The pitcher ones in particular, like it doesn't even show stuff that's really relevant. Like the pitcher ones are so noisy that they show on there.
Get back to pitchers in a second because there's a whole subtopic there that I want to jump into. But before we leave the sort of multiple projection systems comparison thing, Derek, talk a little bit about, since you're the only one of the three of us that actually maintains multiple projection systems, between the BAT and the BAT-X, when you're sitting down at a draft table, how are you melding them? You're presumably not sewing them together completely, because what would be the point of that? But how are you sort of teasing out the best of both into your draft strategy, or how are you utilizing them in tandem?
I just use the BAT-X. It's basically the BAT, but with StatCast added, so it should just be better at this point. And tests have generally shown that to be the case. So the BAT might get retired at some point.
I was just going to say, so why are we putting all this time into the BAT?
Yeah, exactly. That's really kind of all it comes down to.
Okay, fair enough.
The BAT-X is more for 18 plus.
Well, So on the pitcher point, and Derek, you made the point in the StatCast rant about how those StatCast charts are entirely or particularly irrelevant for pitchers. The other thing about pitchers in this day and age that sort of makes me crazy as a projections provider is pitchers have this way of reinventing themselves every season, every 6 weeks, every start, it seems like in some cases, right? Repertoires are changing, arm angles are changing, depth on the slider is changing, velocity is changing. Pitchers are not consistent animals, and projection systems want to take a long view, sort of necessarily, of a pitcher. How do you do that when a pitcher is changing his grip, his arm angle, his arsenal on a regular basis? How are you approaching that problem?
Yeah, so that's one of the big criticisms of projections that I think is the most valid, is that most projection systems don't account for that sort of thing. And we know it's real. We know it happens. We see it. So that's another way that you can adjust a projection based on that kind of thing. The thing is, you have to understand first and foremost that it is not as simple as just looking at a StatCast chart or something like that, because pitching is it's so complex. There's so much that goes into it, and nothing happens in a vacuum. Velocity, movement doesn't happen on its own. It's related to velocity. It's related to spin. It's related to everything. And so if you're just trying to estimate, you might wind up estimating wrong, which is why eventually there's going to be a bad X for the pitchers, hopefully before the start of the season, if we're lucky, that will account for the stuff. It will look at, okay, what actually makes basically what Stuff Plus does. What makes a good fastball? What makes a good curveball? Especially, I don't want to get into it too much because it's not done yet, but essentially we want to account for those things, and we want to account for when somebody has changed up their pitch mix or changed up the quality of their pitches. But defining what makes a good pitch in the first place, I think a lot of people I think they miss on. It's, oh, this guy's curveball has such a great spin rate. It's like, well, the spin rate's not really like all that important. And there's different types of curveballs, and it's like, okay, this guy's got great movement on his curveball, but velocity is actually really important for curveballs. So his curveball might get better actually if he were to have less movement, but it came in harder, and then it would tunnel better and it would get lost in his fastball and it'd be more deceptive. There's so much to it that I feel like people make these assumptions, and a lot of them are untrue. So it doesn't give you a great answer. I guess my best answer is wait for the bad X to come out for pitchers.
Rudy, thoughts on that with the topic?
Yeah, I think, as I get into the back half of drafts, my pitching picks tend to be a lot more speculative, and speculating both on roll change, velocity improvements during the spring training, and stuff, rumors, anything, because back half starting pitching right now feels like a complete dart throw. And so when I'm that kind of thing, when I'm looking in the first half of draft, when I'm trying to get the the foundation of my pitching, I don't mind as a tiebreaker. This draft day, I don't mind that stuff as tiebreakers, and I'm trying to do anything I can to find a reason to make sure all the guys I pick I like, and it's not just because they popped up on the rankings. Basically, trying to avoid 2022 Berrios. Anything that helps me with that, I'm all for, and that's much more of an art than it is probably picking the hitter at that point. But yeah, trying to do it right, trying to avoid over counting something like that, getting too excited. Yeah, it's not as much a challenge for me as it may be for others. But if you're really good at parsing that stuff, it's certainly an advantage come draft day or fab.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I should note, the bat does this a little bit already. It accounts for fastball velocity and fastball spin and changes in it from year to year, from time period to time period, which does help. It helps identify a guy like Carlos Rodon last year, whose velocity just kept going up for years. And but there's a lot more to it than that. Velocity and fastball spin are sticky. They matter a lot, but there's lots of other things that need to be incorporated too if we're talking about stuff.
Yeah, there's one thing because Steamer has that too. There's one thing. It's fastball velocity is probably the purest gauge. If you tell me all of a sudden a guy who was throwing 93 is throwing 95, all of a sudden, yeah, that his projection's going to look a lot better. I'm
Yeah.
willing to go out on the limb, and it also is the opposite. If all of a sudden, if I'm hearing the stuff where, especially because later in March, you're starting to hear like, yeah, he's still a couple miles per hour behind where he was. It's like, yeah, he's not on the team. He's like off the board in those cases. So yeah, but the other stuff, it's tough. But anything to find the Kyle Wrights
Yeah.
is a worthwhile time being spent.
Yeah, they're hard to find. I mean, you get the rights. That's one potential aspect of it. But then you get the a couple of years ago, it was when Giolito broke out, right? And that wasn't even a spring training thing. That was like during a late April IL stint. He like completely rebooted himself, right? And my most recent favorite example of this is Reed Detmers last year, where he went down to AAA. 2 months after throwing the no-hitter, he got completely knocked around, goes down to AAA, and like literally in like one bullpen session, they fix his slider. He throws 10 innings at AAA, strikes out like 20 guys. He's back up in the majors. He's a completely different pitcher. It's just, you get, that switch can flip almost any time. And as a result of that, on the one hand, you have to pay attention to the inevitable litany of new pitch velocity change news we get in March. Jeff Zimmerman, for one, does a great job of tracking those things as he mines the news. At this time of year, you can start picking up the so-and-so went to Driveline to try and, redo their delivery. I just saw that. Who was it this week? It was Urias Familia, I think, who signed with the Diamondbacks after a stint in Driveline. But while you notice all of that stuff, the point I was going to make is none of these things are a cure-all. You'll have the list of all of these guys in mid-March, but by mid-June, more than half of them will be trash. Because, I mean, many of those pitchers are just trash to begin with, and I'm pretty sure Juris Familia is still going to be trash come mid-June, even though he went the drive
They
line.
all throw baseballs faster than you, Ray.
Well, fair.
Put some respect on their name.
I don't know. Juris Familia was in Boston last year. I don't feel any need whatsoever to respect him.
Mitch Keller was the guy last year, right?
There's another one. Absolutely.
He's throwing so hard in spring training, and he was the same guy basically, right? I mean, maybe not the same guy, but he wasn't good.
No, but now, I forget what it is off the top of my head, but changed his arsenal, down to stretch last year in September, and now he's got some buzz about that again. We're gonna do Mitch Keller again this March. It seems like
Upside of 10 wins.
There you go. So question in the chat that kind of gets to what we were talking about, but there's an interim step. The question from the Tin Door is, do you draft straight from projections, or do you think you can beat the projections on individual players? To answer that question, I think we have to skip a middle there's a middle step we're skipping here, which is taking the projection and turning that into valuation. Can we talk a little bit about how we do that and how you end up with the number, or how you then use a projection to differentiate between two players, either when you're evaluating them at the draft table or beforehand or comparing players?
Go ahead, Rudy.
Yeah. No, I mean, I run all the projections through my kind of player rater, and where, so it's helpful because I've consciously gone through and looked at, how I'm going to make adjustments. I think there's definitely been changes over time. I was probably earlier than most in basically throwing out position adjustments. And I still see ones that do that, aside from catcher, of course. But I do think before you're going into draft room and you've done that type of conversion, either using someone else's or doing it yourself, making sure how close you are to the market in terms of hit, starting pitcher, relief pitcher splits. I mean, my process is I'm doing that, and then basically constantly looking at how I compare to ADP. And that's kind of an opportunity to where I'm re-looking at certain projections, either the playing time or even the skills. where things don't seem to be matching up. I'm kind of going in with just like just like the respect you'd have for aggregation, and saying like, yeah, if you take 2 or 3 projection systems, that probably beats one on average. The ADP is a huge aggregation. If it's like something like NFBC, I'm not trusting ESPN or Yahoo because there's huge biases in there because of their draft rooms. But I'm looking at that and constantly trying to figure out, why am I high on this guy? Do I really believe it? As part of it, and sometimes it is little tweaks in the valuation system. I've made a tweak. I felt like my system was going a little too high on average. It was, it was crediting, the top guys a little too much for it. So anything and everything could be impetus for looking for ways to improve.
Anything to add there, Derek?
Not really. I mean, I don't do my own valuation translations like that.
Oh,
I
okay.
kind of just trust others. Fangraphs has an auction calculator. Rudy talks about player rater. There's standard deviation methods and SGP methods, and there's different ways to do it. But I don't have a strong opinion. One way is better than the other or anything.
That's kind of the point I was going to make. It's a perfect jumping off point. Thank you, Derek. If there are valuations, or if you're using valuations, I think the most important thing is to know where they come from, right? For instance, any tool, Rudy, I'm not going to speak for your tool because I don't know it that well, but I'm going to make sort of a generic assumption. Like the HQ tools, we use the percentage valuation method because you can't really use standings gain points on any kind of broad-based commercial tool like ours, because those are based on prior league histories, and you need to have sort of an infinite database of league configurations that I don't have. So you want to know that, or you want to know that, like, I know Ariel does a lot of work with Z-scores on his stuff, but then you also want to make sure out of the box that you know what you're using. For instance, just to plug another tool associated with HQ, I know Rotolab is dropping tonight. Rotolab comes loaded with HQ projections, but that tool supports a number of different valuation methods. So you could take the HQ projections and essentially pick which valuation model you want to put on top of the projections you're downloading. But the one that's out of the box may not necessarily be the one that makes any sense at all for your league. So you want to check those settings before you just burp out the values and sit down at the draft table.
For sure.
All right, let's see what else we got to cover. So talk a little bit about while we've spent 40 minutes talking about projections, how important are they in terms of things that in the end win you your league, or even give you an advantage at the draft table, give you an advantage at the fab table in season? What, as much time as we spend on these, I know from my point of view, it's because the customer base demands them, and not necessarily because I believe they are the differentiator. But tell me whether you guys agree with that or not.
I don't think they're the differentiator. I think they're very important. I think it's more, you can't win a league strictly based on projections, but I do think you can lose one. I think if you're not using projections, you're putting yourself at a massive disadvantage. It doesn't matter which system you want to use. But I think not using them, and there are people that do that. They go by feel. There's always exceptions where people are, whatever, they can figure it out. But for the most part, you're not very good at fantasy if you're not using projections to some extent. And there's more to it. This projections are kind of the starting point, and then there are other skills that are important as well, and other things that factor in, but you have to use them.
Yeah, for me, I consider it table stakes.
Just the word I was going to use.
Yeah, there's people that that are preternaturally good. That I could totally believe there's people that don't need to look at the projections, come up, or look at some and then they come up with their own. If you're one of those, great. You're definitely in the minority. So to me, you're starting with table stakes. I do think it is a pretty big component, but to me, roster construction, optimizing on the draft based on ADP and where the market is. Those tend to be pretty big for me. So I've over time I kind of spend more and more thinking on the roster construction and what I want to build versus and molding that with what I'm good at in season or what I think the market will allow in season. Because that's obviously been, I think anyone who's been playing lately knows it's like trying to find pitching during the season is brutal. Where hitting is a little easier. So to me, that feeds right back into the how I'm going to draft, and going to more quality and quantity with pitching, just because it's so hard in season.
Yeah, 100%. That's right. In any competitive league environment, you can't win your league at the draft table, in my mind. And to your point, Rudy, I think a huge part of it is setting yourself up to have the portfolio of inevitable weaknesses that you know how to deal with in season, right? I mean, you're always gonna get the lightning bolts, the unexpected weaknesses due to injury, suspension, what have you. But you're gonna leave some meat on the bone, and you have some choices at the draft table about what the shape of those are.
Right. And it does feel like in season moves play a little bit more of a role every year than in the past. And, it could be the reliever turnover. It's hard to, I could quantify it. I just haven't measured everything on it, but it does feel like it's a little stronger. And that's where, to me, like projections in season, there's so much less data input that you don't have the ADP that's being informed by so many players. So I think in season there's a lot more opportunities to focus on it. Plus, people get a little fried. I think by the time draft is done, part of their brains kind of shut off for the next 9 months. So it's definitely an area where I think more and more there's been kind of focus by some players. I mean, it's definitely where our subscribers get the most benefit.
I was thinking about, as we were talking, doubling back on this ADP conversation a little bit, because I think all three of us have made some reference to ADP as the representation of the market or the comparison point for projections. As somebody in the chat noted, it is sort of the ultimate aggregator because even at this time of year in late January, the denominator of all drafts in the NFBC database, to name one, starts to get so big that there's just a ton of data there. But the question I wanted to ask you guys is, that data is now spread more and more across different formats, different draft styles, different rule sets. In some cases, in all cases, really different rule sets than we'll be playing in our mid-late March leagues. So what are the limitations of that ADP data at different points in the offseason? Like, for instance, we had, of course, the 99-day period last year where there was no news and no players were moving up and down because they had lost jobs or fallen off a motorcycle and not told anybody or any of that sort of stuff. And we had this sort of bubble where, at this time of year, we were in a news vacuum and there was really no reason for ADP to move other than the crowd, the wisdom of the crowd changing.
Unless you hung out with Fernando Tatis.
Well, exactly. Unless you were, the guy who scraped them up off the side of the road. So we're in a different environment now. And how are we, what are the limitations or what are the cautions of using that ADP data that, is now dynamic, but has such a big denominator already that sometimes the movement in it is hard to detect.
Yeah, I mean, the NFBC ADP thing allows for some really great filtering.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the first thing is get all the best ball stuff out. That's not indicative. Best ball is generally going to be points driven. Get rid of points driven stuff because it's not going to value starters and relievers the same. You're in a points format, you've devalued stolen bases. And when I say devalued it, you're probably valuing it more like it should be in real life. But it's such a a disproportionate thing in Roto that I think so. Yeah, for now, like you can't take the overall. You have to get the gladiator stuff out there. So the draft champion stuff to me is the only ADP I'm looking at until main event starts. Um, you know, and if I was doing a 12 team, maybe I'll look at the OC one. But I find like the draft champions one, it is a similar drafting. It just you just have 50 rounds versus 30, but at the end of the day, like the ADP is not a huge deal for me outside after like the first 15 rounds or so. At a certain point, then I'm willing to jump a guy up 1 or 2 rounds if I really want him and I'm not feeling overly confident he's going to last.
And that feeling is really just informed by the gut that you develop from drafting the entire offseason, right? I mean, is there a better answer than that?
No, I mean, throughout the draft, there's ideally you're not banking on one guy, so you've got like this little group of guys, and then if 1 or 2 go, then you move a little quicker if there's a couple that you like. So yeah, and then you could throughout the season, I'm haunted by the guy what I chose wrong, or like at main event last year, I think it was Aaron Ashby, Lazardo, or Julio Rodriguez. And that laugh is the one that's telling you I chose Aaron Ashby.
Mine was George Springer, the pick before Aaron Judge. So, been there.
Oh, you won. Sorry. Yeah, that might actually. No. Well, because you bet on George Springer being healthier than Judge.
Yeah, exactly. Oops. In a related story, I did not cash in that league.
Yeah. So it's yeah. So I think but yeah, no, but I think the NFBC ADP tool is great for people that are in like ESPN or Yahoo leagues. The default draft room thing has such a huge gravitational pull that they use that, but it doesn't. Well, in NFBC, it's a little bit governed by the ADP, but I would focus on the NFBC ADP versus whatever you'd see in the draft room, which could be more the Frankenstein.
Yeah, the all denominator ADP, right?
Yeah, I don't. But and obviously that always scares you if the guy that you're hoping is around in 2 rounds suddenly shows up at the top of that draft room thing. It's a pretty good impulse to move quicker versus later.
Yeah, for sure.
Best solution to all of it is just play auctions.
Nah, can't do a slow auction.
No, not a slow auction, but
this time of year, it's so great to have like just a slow draft or 2 going because it allows you to think. I think auctions is when you really know you've got everything figured out, and but now is that the time it's like, oh, each round I could look at Baseball HQ, I could look at my rankings, I could wonder what the hell am I thinking? Why is this guy at the top of my list? And rerun the projections. That's the fun part of this time of year.
Derek, let me put you on the spot. You did a great presentation in Arizona about on a panel about some of the new rules this year. You had really good data that I've been leveraging all winter about the impact of the shift, among other things. Even though you had a as I remember, you had an incorrect graphic about what defensive configurations are allowed and not allowed. But I've forgiven you for that because the data was.
Thanks for bringing that up.
But my macro point about the new rules is that as a projection provider, the lack of a foundation for any given season / data set is maddening to me because we never know what the ball is going to be. We have some idea of what the rules are going to be, but we don't exactly know how that's going to play out. And the error bars on projections are bad enough as they are, big enough as they are before the MLB starts sort of keeping the rules of the game secret from us. Talk to me about how that affects your process or how you're approaching those things this year. I mean, you could come up with an individual answer to how you're addressing the shift or anything, but there's in the introduction to the forecaster, Ron Chandler called this the aggregation of all of those things together, the interplay of them that no one's ever tested, sort of the chaos theory aspect of it. How do you deal with that from in a role that requires the expectation of precision?
Yeah, so it's a very love-hate relationship that I have with these
You
types
love,
of.
I hate. Is that
So I hate it because I just want to relax in the off season. I just want to take January and February and just go lay on a beach somewhere or like do something that isn't studying what happens when the universal DH is a thing and then it's not a thing, or the ball changes, or we have to deal with the shift and the bases and everything now. Like, I just want to take a break, but I can't because we got to account for these things. But I kind of love it too, because this isn't something that I'm the only one that has to deal with. Everybody has to deal with this. And I have confidence that I think my ways of dealing with it are going to be better than at least the majority of the way people are going to be dealing with it. You know, it's tricky, it's tough. We're not going to get to any sort of level of 100% precision, but I think that my level of precision that I can get to is probably going to be better than certain other people's. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're not. But I think to this point, I've done a pretty good job accounting for ball and DH and everything else. And so there's no I don't have an answer for you right now that says this is the exact thing I'm doing. Like, I'm still studying it. I did a presentation, like you said, in Arizona, where I dug into the shift a little bit. I'm still trying to fine tune that and look at it and consider other things with it. But ultimately, I will be making adjustments. And the main thing I think that's important is just being transparent with people about what I'm adjusting for, what's going into the projection, so they understand what's there, what's not there, and kind of, we said it earlier, understanding what goes into a projection is important so that you don't double count things, or so that what you're looking at.
so? Bringing this full circle, Rudy, let me stop for a second. Derek, I'll give you props. You completely nailed the Camden Yards changes and those effects last year. So for those watching
So
this,
even that, though, I didn't nail Camden Yards. I projected Camden Yards was going to be a big deal, and Camden Yards was a massive
Huge
deal.
deal.
Yeah, I undershot it.
yeah, but you got significant. You just didn't get like earth shattering, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was that and the humidors last year
Yeah,
had
the humidors, and
across all the stadiums.
that's probably the different. It's probably Camden Yards plus humidor. Rudy, I was going to hit you with the follow up to what Derek was just saying. I heard from our subscribers at HQ the same point that Derek just made, that what they really want from us in terms of how we deal with these new rules is transparency. Tell me what you're doing. So, as we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation, if I want to make further adjustments, I know where you
Right.
started. I know what you did. I'm not going to double count. Now, my follow up question is, given what we were just talking about, and given that you can't be transparent with an aggregator, is this a year to not use aggregators because you're going to have many different soups in there as to how they're dealing with these things?
I don't. I mean, every year you could probably make that call. Like I said, my feeling is I would probably stick with one, or with at probably at most two or three that you really value, and with the diversity. Like, I will say, the one thing that drives me a little nuts, but it's really just me, is like people combining Steamer and the Bat on Fangraphs, which is so, one, makes tons of sense because one site and you've got the ID to map on, but it's the same playing time. So if your whole point's to diversify, you've got to get two sources with multiple playing time things that ideally don't have a dependency. I don't know what, so in this case, maybe if it's ATC, well, that's depending on Fangraphs depth charts probably is its main component. So that would, but this year is going to be no different than any. There's always some wrinkle that's going in. I just think, like, if you have a question like that about a source because you don't trust that they'll adjust right, you probably shouldn't have them in your aggregate to begin with.
So I think I gave each of you a chance to get your primary rant off your chest, and I got mine out too. So I feel good about that. Anything else we left?
This is pretty positive, though.
Pretty positive. Yeah. Anything else you guys wanted to points you wanted to make or had on your agenda that we didn't work our way around to in 56 minutes or whatever it was?
I think we covered a lot of it.
Yeah, no, I think we did.
Seems like that too. Nick should be back any minute, I would think.
Well, of course,
Of
yes,
course he
I'm
is.
here.
Hello.
I have the sirens go off when I hear that. No, first and foremost, I think it's really cool to hear the good stuff about your projection systems, the bad stuff about it. I think honestly, what I found most interesting, I've actually seen lots of places say like, cool, I take this percentage from ATC and this percentage from this other thing, and I go. And then Derek's like, it already does that. Wait, hold on a second.
Yeah.
And that makes a whole lot of sense. I do wonder if it's saying like, hey, we think ATC is like it does it really well, that aggregate, but not as much as we want it to. And that might be the percentages of, I don't know. It's all a mess. Derek, any quick thoughts on that, or Rudy?
I mean, I think if you're gonna aggregate ATC with anything, like you're not doing it with like 5 other systems. You pick ATC and you pick one, say the bad X, just to pick one random example, where we said that the aggregate basically brings everything really close and you lose kind of those outliers. But maybe you don't want the outliers to be so extreme. You want to bring them a little bit closer. So you aggregate like that's the only that's if I was gonna aggregate ATC with anything, I think that's the only way that makes sense to do it. Otherwise, if you want to use an aggregate, just use ATC.
Absolutely.
I operate on the assumption that anybody who is playing has a finite amount of time available, right? And I think creating your own aggregation, because I've done it before and I've seen the results, is a terrible use of the limited resource of time that you have. You're
agree.
much better off using your hours in some other direction. If you really want to have an aggregation, go grab ATC or one of them that are already out there. Cooking your own is hours and hours of wasted work that will not get you to a better place. And I can almost guarantee you'll have some formula in your spreadsheet that's broken and giving you worse results.
Yeah, bemoaning all the Garcias that name their kid Luis.
100%. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
It's 5, I think.
Oh boy. I mean, there's also the fact that some of them use an accent, some of them don't. So there's that aspect as well, and making sure that we have it included correctly.
Awful. I feel awful about not having the accent marks. I feel I'm totally stripping Latin culture, but it is such a pain in the ass. It's whoever's fault that does ASCII or whatever.
It's not
my fault.
It's nothing against the accent. It's that it can be confusing trying to even like search for it and stuff on sites too of it. And we just need the better technology so that it recognizes both the accent and not the accent. But another thing I wanted to ask was, Ray, as you mentioned, Derek, you knocked it out of the park with no pun intended about Baltimore being a major factor and the humidor as well being a major impact. So in that light, what is it this year that we really need to take into account for when it comes to parks changing?
Well, we have 3 of them. We have the Rogers Center, we have Citi Field, and we have Comerica changing. I'm going to be accounting for it. I haven't fully run through it yet. It does appear that none of the changes are going to be overly significant. Comerica may be the biggest based on what I've done so far. I feel like the Rogers Center thing, people have been blown out of proportion. Like, oh, it's going to be this great hitters park now because they're moving some of the fences in. But they're only moving it in a couple places. And the walls are going up, which is going to offset it. The walls are going up quite a bit. So I don't think ultimately it's going to make that big of a difference in Rogers Center.
Okay. But Comerica?
A little bit, yeah, especially for home runs. But I think it depends on what you care about. I think the way I had it projected was basically home runs are going to go, I forget, up or down, whichever one it is. Up, I think.
Up.
But
that's just with Matt Boyd being there.
But the overall,
you just had to do that, didn't you, Rudy?
Yeah. It's right there. It's like Matt Boyd just threw it right over the middle.
Oh boy, yeah. And last one was Citi Field. How much should we be weighing that one in?
That seemed pretty minor, the most minor of the 3.
Okay, all right. So correct me if I'm wrong, the 3 of you. Not nearly the same change as far as Orioles stuff. So
that's the thing, though. Like,
that's the park stuff, though. But the shift.
Well, right.
The shift and how that could impact both, particularly lefty pull guys who got shifted a lot, as well as pitchers who are much more dependent on ground ball BABIP.
And then, of course,
we're really just estimating when it comes to parks. We know how the dimensions are changing, and we can make estimates based on that. But like I said, I undershot Camden. So like, it's possible I'm undershooting these other ones too. Like based on years of data and other parks doing it, I think this is right on average, but there are always going to be unforeseen things, you know, unintended consequences when we have this kind of stuff.
And also,
Nick, I'll
of
just
course,
tell you what.
yeah.
Sorry, I'll just tell you one thing we did in our projections this year because of the rollout of the humidors last year. We're actually basing our adjustments in the projections based on park factors on 1 year park factors, which we've never done before. But because for 20 of the 30 parks, you'd be using 2 years of humidor data out of the 3 that have no value anymore because the humidor kind of changes the rules. I'm to say I'm confident in that. I'm not, but it was the best of a bunch of bad options.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's also the fact, of course, discovering that the balls once again are not consistent, and who knows?
You're getting me started again. You don't want that.
I know. You guys already mentioned it, but
which team is going to have commemorative days? I'm gonna wait based on commemorative days.
Oh, yeah, right. We should be doing DFS stuff about that, like Field of Dreams games.
The Yankees on Old Timers Day, and
but then again, Drew Smiley killed it in the Field of Dreams. Nick Lodolo didn't, but Drew Smiley did. So who knows what's going to happen there. But anyway, Ray, Derek, Rudy, thank you guys so much for taking part in this. I wouldn't feel right not having you all here at PitchCon. So thanks for being here.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks for